Most stories, they start at the beginning. But this one, a story about a crime, a family, and a long, long road to a very final end. This one starts where it all concluded, inside an execution chamber, after nearly half a century. 46 years. Just let that sink in for a second. That is how long it took. On November 13th, 2025, a man named Bryan Jennings was executed for a crime he committed when he was just 20 years old. 46 years. That's a whole lifetime. It's long enough to raise a family, build a career, to grow old. So the big question here, the one that just hangs over this entire story, is a simple one. Why? Why on earth did it take so long? I mean, the amount of time that passed here is it's staggering to look at. On the left, you've got the man back in 1979, a 20-year-old Marine home on leave. And on the right, that's the same man in 2025, a 66-year-old death row inmate. He literally lived an entire adult life behind bars, while the justice system just churned along slowly, year after year, toward this final day. Okay, so to really get a handle on the end of this story, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning. Back to a quiet night in Florida, May 1979. A crime was committed that was so clear-cut, solved so quickly, that nobody could have possibly imagined it would take almost 5 decades to finally close the book on it. The whole awful tragedy just unfolded with shocking speed. We're talking less than 24 hours from the abduction to the arrest. A little girl taken from her own bed at night. And the next morning, a frantic community search kicks off. That afternoon, her body is found in a canal. And by that evening, the police had their man. And the evidence? It was overwhelming. Fingerprints, shoe prints, witnesses. There was no mystery here, no whodunit. The case was basically solved almost as soon as it began. So if the crime was solved in a single day, what took justice 46 years? Well, this is where the story pivots. We move away from the grim certainty of the crime and into the deep, complicated, and, honestly, often frustrating labyrinth of the American legal system. And this is what that legal labyrinth looked like in practice. Just a frustrating loop. Jennings was sentenced to die, but that sentence got reversed on appeal. So he was sentenced to die a second time. And guess what? It was reversed on appeal again. Now, it's really, really important to get this straight. His guilt was never in question. Not for a second. These reversals were all about legal technicalities. Things like improper jury selection in one trial, or how evidence about his background was handled in another. He finally got his third and final death sentence in 1986. But that just started the clock on 3 more decades of appeals that kept him alive and kept this case wide open. And while all that legal machinery was grinding on year after year, there was this profound human cost. Because beyond the courtrooms and the convicted man, there was the family of the little girl whose life was stolen. For them, this wasn't about legal filings or technicalities. It was about a wound that was just never, ever allowed to heal. This right here, this contrast, is the absolute heart of their pain. Their daughter was frozen in time at 6 years old, a ghost in old photographs. Meanwhile, the man who killed her continued to live, to breathe, to age from a 20-year-old to a 66-year-old. He had decades to file his appeals. She never even got a chance to go to the 2nd grade. For her family, that was the real injustice of the long delay. There's a quote from the source material that just captures their experience perfectly. Grief doesn't keep time the way the courts do. For the legal system, time is measured in filing deadlines and court dates. But for this family, every delay, every new hearing, it was like reliving the nightmare all over again. Their grief wasn't some file in a cabinet. It was a constant living thing for 46 years. And that brings us right back to where we started. After all the appeals, all the delays, all the decades, the story finally comes full circle. We're back to the day of the execution, 46 years after a little girl was taken from her bed. You can see the clinical precision of the day here just unfolding like clockwork. The final last-ditch appeals from his lawyers fail in the morning. The U.S. Supreme Court declines to step in that afternoon, and by the evening, a process that was set in motion decades ago finally reaches its end. At 6:15 p.m., he was asked for a final statement. 5 minutes later, at 6:20, he was pronounced dead. So, what was his final statement? After all that time, after 46 years, when he was asked if he had any last words, Bryan Jennings said just one thing. No. No apology to the family, no explanation, no remorse. Just that one stark word before the end.
And the method itself was just as detached, just as procedural as his final word. The three-drug protocol is designed to be scientific, systematic. First a sedative to render unconsciousness, then a paralytic, and then the drug that stops the heart. A quiet, chemical end to a story that began with such terrible violence.
But after the execution, the story doesn't just stop. It shifts. The focus moves away from the man on the gurney and to the people who had waited on the other side of the glass. The family that had spent almost their entire lives waiting for this exact moment. So what came next for them?
So, what was their reaction? Well, it wasn't what you might think. There were no cheers, no celebrations. Instead, witnesses described it as a different kind of silence. The pain of their loss, that was still there. That would never go away. But the waiting was over. The constant burden of the open legal case, that was finally lifted.
Now, to put all of this in a bit of context, it's worth knowing this wasn't happening in a vacuum. As you can see here, Jennings' execution was the 16th in Florida that year, a record in the modern era for the state. And while a 46-year delay is exceptionally long, protracted appeals mean that the average time spent on death row in the U.S. is now over 2 decades. So for the state, this was another number in a record year. But for this family, it was everything.
And that's really what it all came down to. The simple, exhausted, and profound words the family could finally say to each other that night. After 46 years of fighting, of waiting, of grieving under the shadow of this unfinished story, they could finally say, it's over.
And this leaves all of us with a final, pretty heavy question. When a crime is solved in a day, but the sentence takes 46 years to actually carry out, what does justice truly look like? Is it the final act in an execution chamber? Or is it a family, after half a century, finally finding some measure of peace? It's a question worth thinking about.